Look at this photograph. Don't rush, there is no rush here. This image was taken sometime in the mid-20th century on a street in Harlem, New York. The exact date is uncertain. The photographer's name has been lost. The negative, if it survives at all, sits somewhere in a box that has not been opened in decades. But the photograph itself, this single, frozen rectangle of black and gray and white, has survived. And if you look at it long enough, it begins to breathe. Notice first the street itself. The pavement is slightly wet, or perhaps it only appears that way in the silver wash of the photograph. There are cracks in the concrete near the curb, long branching lines that suggest a street that has been repaired and re-repaired over many years, each patch a small record of something that broke and was put back together. A city doesn't pave its streets all at once. It patches them, one section at a time, and in those patches you can read something like a history. The buildings along the block are 3 and 4 stories tall. Brick. Most of the brickwork is dark, soot-stained, or perhaps simply old. The mortar between the bricks faded to a shade just lighter than the brick itself. The upper floors have windows. Many of them are open, even in this photograph where we cannot know the season. Curtains, white or nearly white, hang slack in the frames. No wind or very little wind on the day this was taken. The storefronts on the ground floor are alive in a way the upper floors are not. There are signs, hand-lettered signs and printed signs, and signs painted directly onto glass. You can read some of them if you look carefully. There is a barbershop. There is what appears to be a dry goods store, though the lettering is partially obscured by a shadow that falls across the lower half of the sign. There is a small lunch counter, or something that functions as one, with a handwritten menu visible through the front glass, though the individual items are too small to read in this reproduction of the image. And there are people. Not many. This is not a crowded street. This is a mid-morning street or an early afternoon street, a street between the rushes when the people who are working are already gone and the people who are not working are inside. There are perhaps 7 or 8 visible figures. A man near the barber shop, standing still, his hands in the pockets of a coat that is slightly too heavy for what the light suggests is a warm day. 2 women further down the block, walking together, one of them carrying a bag. A child small enough that from this distance you cannot easily tell if it is a boy or a girl, crouching near the curb, looking at something on the ground that we cannot see. A delivery truck is parked at the far end of the block, its side door open. There is no driver visible. Someone left that truck with its door open and walked away, and this photograph captured the absence. That is the street. That is what you can see. But here is the thing about photographs. What you can see is only the beginning. In 1958, a city housing inspector named Walter Greer filed a report about this block. The report was routine, a standard inspection of building conditions, plumbing, heat, structural integrity. It sat in a municipal filing cabinet for several years before someone noticed something in the margin. A handwritten note in pencil, just 6 words. Ask about the arrangement on Sundays. Nobody knows who wrote those words. Nobody knows what arrangement they referred to. Walter Greer himself, when interviewed years later by a graduate student doing urban planning research, said he did not remember writing any such note. He was not certain, he said, that it was even his handwriting. The arrangement on Sundays. That question, barely a question at all, really, just 6 penciled words in a margin, became the beginning of something that no one ever finished. In the early 1960s, a young researcher named Dorothea Sims was working on a study of retail patterns in northern Manhattan. Her project was academic, an attempt to understand how small businesses in black neighborhoods secured financing in an era when banks routinely denied them loans. It was careful, methodical work, the kind that fills footnotes rather than headlines. While tracing ownership records for the businesses on this block, Dorothea Sims found something she hadn't expected. She found that 3 of the storefronts on this street, the barber shop, the dry goods store, and a small insurance office around the corner, had all transferred ownership within a period of 4 months in the early 1950s, not sold in the conventional sense, transferred. The paperwork described the transactions as gifts. Legal gifts, properly recorded, tax implications properly noted. One property transferred from a man named Ezra Coleman to his cousin. One from a woman named Mrs. Alberta Purvis to a church association. One from a partnership, two brothers named Whitfield, to a third party whose name Dorothea Sims could not trace beyond the transfer document itself. Unusual, not illegal, just unusual. She made a note, she moved on, she had other blocks to document, other records to trace. But the note stayed with her, because there was something else she had found, buried in the same filing cabinet as the ownership records. A small collection of letters, business correspondence, typed on thin paper, some of them carbon copies so faint they were barely legible. The letters were dated over a span of about 18 months. They were written between several of the business owners on this block and a man identified only by his initials, R.D. R.D. never appeared in any ownership record. His name, if those were even his initials, did not appear in the city directory for the relevant years. He received letters. He apparently sent letters, though none of those were in the file. The letters that were in the file referred to him with a kind of deference that Dorothea Sims described in her notes as unusual for business correspondence between equals. Not formal deference, not the deference of an employee to a boss. Something more like the deference of neighbors to someone whose opinion carries weight beyond the obvious reasons. She wrote in her research journal, "There is a center of gravity here that I cannot locate." A center of gravity she could not locate. Now look again at the photograph. Look at the man standing near the barber shop, the one with his hands in his coat pockets. He is standing still, but not the way a person stands still when they are waiting for a bus or resting their feet. He is standing still the way a person stands still when they are paying attention. His body is turned slightly toward the street rather than toward the storefront behind him. He is watching something or watching for something, and he is doing it in a way that is designed not to look like watching. That posture has a name in neighborhoods where it appears regularly. The name is not written down anywhere. It is simply understood. To understand what Dorothea Sims was looking at, you have to understand what Harlem was in the years surrounding this photograph. Not what it has been made into in legend, not the jazz age romance, not the literary renaissance seen only from the outside, not the poverty narrative that came later. What it actually was on a daily basis at the level of the street. It was a community that had been, for decades, systematically denied access to the formal mechanisms that other communities took for granted. Banks would not extend credit to black business owners on terms that made any sense. Insurance companies either refused policies outright or priced them so high as to be functionally exclusionary. City services, sanitation, building maintenance, road repair arrived later and left sooner in Harlem than in comparable blocks in other neighborhoods. The school buildings were older, the hospitals were more crowded, the political representation was limited. And yet the community functioned. Businesses opened and stayed open for decades, buildings were maintained, children were educated, families built lives that stretched across generations. How? The answer is not mysterious in the way that mysteries usually are. The answer is a network, not a secret network, not a conspiracy, not an underworld. A web of relationships, obligations, reputations, and agreements that operated in the spaces where formal institutions were absent or hostile. A system built from the available materials, which in this case were people. The barbershop is a good place to start. In most American neighborhoods, the barbershop is primarily a place where you get a haircut. In communities like this one, like many black communities throughout the 20th century, the barbershop was something additional. It was a clearinghouse, not for illegal activity but for information. Who was hiring? Who was looking for a room to rent? Who had a truck and might be willing to help with a move? Who was struggling to pay rent and needed to know about the emergency fund at the church? Who had a son that needed guidance and might benefit from a conversation with a particular deacon, or a particular business owner, or a particular older man who had navigated certain kinds of trouble before? The dry goods store served a similar function, but differently. The woman who ran it, her name was, in various documents, rendered as Mrs. Purvis or Alberta Purvis or simply Alberta, had been on this block since the late 1930s. She had extended credit to neighbors during the Depression years. Not large amounts. $1 here, 50 cents there, enough to make a difference on a particular Tuesday. She kept no written records of these transactions. She remembered them. And the people she had helped remembered them too, in a way that created a bond that was not quite debt and not quite friendship, but something that combined elements of both. When Dorothea Sims interviewed one of Mrs. Purvis's former customers, an elderly man named Roosevelt Banks, who had grown up on this block and moved to the Bronx in the 1960s, he described Alberta Purvis with a phrase that Sims found herself returning to again and again in her notes. She knew what things were worth, Roosevelt Banks said, not what they cost, what they were worth. There is a difference, and it matters. A thing's cost is its price. A thing's worth is what it means within a system of relationships. In a neighborhood where formal credit was unavailable, the worth of $1 extended on a difficult Tuesday was not $1. It was evidence of a relationship. It was a record, stored in human memory, of who could be trusted and how. This is the street beneath the street. This is what the photograph cannot show you directly, but begins to suggest if you look long enough. Look at the two women walking together in the middle distance. One of them is carrying a bag, a heavy bag, it looks like, pulling her shoulders slightly to one side. Where is she going? Where did she come from? It is impossible to say. But the fact that they are walking together, rather than separately, means something. In a neighborhood like this one, in this era, your walking companions were a kind of social annotation. They told people something about who you were connected to, and through those connections, what your reputation was, and through that reputation, what access you had. The social geography of a single block could be astonishingly complex. In 1974, a community organization based near this block conducted a series of recorded interviews with longtime residents. The project was called the Harlem Oral Memory Archive. It was small and underfunded, and many of its tapes were subsequently lost or damaged, but a portion of the transcripts survived, and they are remarkable documents. What is remarkable about them is not any single revelation. What is remarkable is how consistently the interviewees contradict each other on questions that should have simple answers. For example, the church. There was a storefront church on this block, or near this block, or possibly around the corner. The location varies depending on who you ask. It had been there, in various forms and under various names, since at least the 1940s. Multiple interviewees mentioned it. All of them agreed it was important. None of them agreed on precisely what it was. One woman, identified in the transcripts only as Mrs. T, age 68, described it as a conventional Pentecostal congregation, nothing unusual about it, just a place where people went to pray and be in community. Another interviewee, a man identified as Mr. L, age 71, described the same church as the place where the real decisions got made, by which he seemed to mean decisions about the neighborhood, about who got support, who didn't, what problems were handled internally, and what problems were brought to outside authorities. A third interviewee, a younger woman identified as Dr. age 34, said she had grown up in the neighborhood and had never been sure the church was even a real church, in the sense of being officially registered, which struck her as strange because she had heard services there as a child. 3 people, 3 different accounts of the same institution. This is not unusual in oral history. Memory is reconstructive. It reshapes events around the meaning we have assigned to them over time. 2 people can attend the same meeting and leave with genuinely different memories of what was decided. This is not dishonesty. It is how human memory actually works. But in this case, the contradictions point toward something else as well. They point toward an institution that meant different things to different people, which suggests it was doing more than one kind of work simultaneously. A church that was just a church where decisions got made, a church that might not have been registered. All 3 of these things could be true at once, and none of them would require anyone to be lying. Now there is another detail. In the oral history transcripts across multiple interviews, there are references to a particular Sunday practice, not a church service exactly, something that happened after the church service, or instead of it, or alongside it. The transcripts are frustratingly vague on the specifics. People would gather, one person says. There would be a discussion, says another. Things got sorted out, says a third. Things got sorted out. The arrangement on Sundays. Do you remember those 6 penciled words from the housing inspector's report? The words that no one claimed. Ask about the arrangement on Sundays. The phrase now appears twice, in 2 completely unrelated documents, separated by several years. That is when a coincidence starts to feel like something else. Dorothea Sims returned to this block in 1968, several years after her original research. She was working on a different project by then, a study of property speculation in Harlem during the post-war decades. But something kept pulling her back to these few blocks, to the ownership transfers she had found earlier, to the letters addressed to R.D. She began pulling property records more systematically. What she found, over the course of several months of work, was a pattern she described as a strange stability in an era of instability. Throughout the 1950s and into the early 1960s, Harlem experienced significant property turnover. Absentee landlords sold buildings to other absentee landlords. Speculation was common. Businesses closed and reopened under different management. This was typical of many urban neighborhoods in the post-war period, a time of significant demographic and economic change. But on this particular block, and on 2 or 3 surrounding blocks, the turnover rate was dramatically lower than the neighborhood average. Businesses that had been in operation in 1950 were still in operation in 1965. Property ownership transferred rarely, and when it did, it transferred within a small group of connected owners. The cousin, the church association, the untraceable third party, rather than to outside speculators. The block had been held together, deliberately it appeared, but by what mechanism? There was no formal business association registered for these blocks. There was no property trust, no cooperative. The deed records showed individual ownership of individual properties, nothing unusual on their face. And yet the effect was collective. The block had behaved, over 15 years, as if it were coordinated by something. Sims found one more document that she could not fully explain. A letter, written in the early 1960s, from a bank officer to a property owner on this block. The bank officer was declining a refinancing application. The letter was politely worded, professionally phrased, and conveyed, essentially, that the bank was not interested in doing business with this particular property at this particular time. At the bottom of the letter, in handwriting that matched none of the other handwriting in the files, was a single line, handled through the usual channel. Handled through the usual channel. The loan was refused by the bank, and apparently the matter was handled, whatever that meant, through some other arrangement. Which arrangement, through whom, and how was it handled exactly? Look at the photograph again. The insurance office that Sims had traced is, if you are reading this image correctly, just at the edge of the frame. Part of a sign is visible, the very end of a word, perhaps 2 or 3 letters, before the edge of the photograph cuts it off. You cannot read what it says, but you can see that it was there. You can see the window and a figure inside, standing or sitting. It's impossible to tell, that is barely visible through the glass, more shadow than shape. Someone was in that office. Someone was always in that office, it seems, based on multiple accounts from the oral history archive. Even on days when the office appeared closed, curtains drawn, door locked, someone was inside. What did that person do all day? The historian who came closest to understanding what had been built on these blocks was a man named Clarence Odell, who worked in the 1970s and early 1980s on what he called the informal economy of trust in mid-century black urban communities. Odell was not specifically focused on Harlem or on this block. He was building a broader theory, but his work provides the clearest framework for understanding what Dorothea Sims had been finding for 2 decades without being able to name. What Odell described was this: in communities that are excluded from formal economic and political institutions, other institutions develop. These institutions are not always visible as institutions. They look like a barbershop. They look like a dry goods store. They look like a church. They look like a network of people who know each other and have reason to trust each other and have built that trust over time through accumulated small obligations. But beneath the appearance of ordinary neighborhood life, these institutions are performing complex functions. They are allocating credit, not bank credit, but social credit. The reputation of knowing who can be trusted with a loan of $20 tells you something about who can be trusted with a larger responsibility. Mrs. Purvis, who extended $1 on a difficult Tuesday, was not just performing charity. She was generating information about character, about reliability, about how people behave under pressure. And she was storing that information in her memory and sharing it selectively through her relationships with others on the block. They are mediating disputes. When two neighbors have a problem, a property line disagreement, a noise complaint, a debt that has gone unpaid, there are formal channels for resolving such things: police, courts, official complaints. But formal channels are slow, expensive, and in this era, often hostile to black residents seeking redress. So problems were brought, instead, to people whose standing in the community gave them the authority to hear all sides and suggest a resolution that both parties could accept. Not arbitration in a legal sense, something older and more personal than that. They are managing information, deciding what gets shared with whom and when, not in a sinister way, in the way that any community manages its reputation with the outside world. If there is trouble on the block, the first question is not always whether to call the authorities. The first question is whether the trouble can be handled without the authorities, not to protect wrongdoing, but because the authorities, in this time and place, were not reliably helpful and were sometimes actively harmful. They are protecting property, not through private security or legal enforcement, but through collective reputation. The reason speculators had difficulty acquiring buildings on these blocks was not that the buildings were legally protected from speculation. It was that the owners of those buildings had relationships with each other and with the community that made selling to an outside speculator a form of social cost as well as a financial transaction. To sell to a speculator was to exit a network of mutual obligation. Some people were willing to pay that cost, many were not. None of this was mapped. It was never written down in a form that made it legible to the outside. It existed in the heads of the people who participated in it and in the informal practices of daily life on the street. RD, whoever he was, appears to have been a central node in this network, not a boss, not a leader in any formal sense, something more like a switchboard operator, a person who knew enough people and who those people trusted enough that he could route problems and resources and information to where they needed to go. The arrangement on Sundays was, perhaps, nothing more than a standing conversation, a regular gathering of people who needed to compare notes, who owed what, who needed what problems were coming, and how might they be addressed before they arrived. Nothing illegal, nothing secret, exactly, just invisible to anyone who wasn't part of it. Dorothea Sims tried, for several more years, to identify RD. She never did. She found two candidates. The first was a man named Raymond Dempsey, who had lived near this block in the 1940s and early 1950s before moving to Queens. His name appeared in some of the business records from that period, and one of the carbon copy letters used a salutation that might, if you were inclined to see it, be read as addressing someone whose first name began with R but Raymond Dempsey, when Sims located him in Queens in 1971, was a retired postal worker with no apparent connection to the insurance office or the property transfers. He remembered the neighborhood. He did not remember any arrangement. He said this with the particular blankness of a person who either genuinely does not remember or who has had occasion to not remember things before. The second candidate was more interesting. His name appeared only once in a handwritten note attached to one of the church's old financial records that had been donated to a local archive by the church's last surviving deacon. The name was Robert Davenport. There was no other record of Robert Davenport in any of the documents Sims had assembled. He was not in the city directory. He was not on the voter rolls. He was not in the property records. He left no tax record, no mail record, no newspaper mention. Either Robert Davenport was a ghost, or Robert Davenport was someone who had very deliberately left as few traces as possible. A person who leaves no traces is a person who has reasons to leave no traces. Those reasons may be benign. They may be practical. A man who operates informally, who mediates disputes and arranges matters that don't fit neatly into any official category, has good practical reasons for not appearing in official records. It doesn't mean he was doing anything wrong. It means he was doing something that didn't translate easily into the language of official record keeping. Or it means something else, and that is the problem. From outside the network, you cannot tell. Sims wrote in a letter to Clarence Odell in the mid-1970s, "I keep arriving at a door I cannot open, not because it is locked, but because I cannot find it. I know it is there. The shape of everything around it tells me it must be there, but the door itself is invisible to me." Odell wrote back, "That is because the door was built to be invisible to people who weren't invited in. That was the point of it, not to exclude you personally, to protect everyone on the other side of it." That exchange sat in Dorothea Sims's files for decades. It is, arguably, the clearest statement of what she had spent 20 years looking for without being able to find. Now look at the photograph one more time. Look at the child crouching by the curb. What is that child looking at? Something on the ground, a coin, perhaps, or an insect, or a crack in the pavement, or simply the pattern of the concrete, which is interesting if you are small enough to be close to it and young enough to find it worth your full attention. That child does not know, in this moment, about the arrangement on Sundays, does not know about RD, or about the property transfers, or about the letters in carbon copy that no one can fully read, does not know about Mrs. Purvis's credit system, or the barbershop's role as a clearinghouse, or the insurance office with its always-present interior shadow. That child just knows the street, knows it the way children know streets, as a physical environment, as a set of textures and sounds and smells, as a place where certain people are always standing, and certain stores always smell a particular way, and certain doors are always open, and certain windows always have curtains. But that child is growing up inside the network, is absorbing it without knowing it is absorbing it, the way children absorb the language they are born into. The manners, the deferences, the unspoken rules about who you greet and how, about which adults can be approached with a question and which should simply be acknowledged and passed, about what you say to a stranger and what you never say to a stranger. In 10 years, or 15, that child will know things about this block that no researcher will ever be able to document. And in 50 years, those things will be gone, either because the child is gone, or because the block has changed so profoundly that the knowledge no longer applies. This is the nature of informal knowledge. It lives in people and in places and in the relationship between the two. When either the people or the places change, the knowledge changes with them and eventually disappears. Dorothea Sims published her research in a limited academic edition in 1979. It was well regarded in a small field and essentially unknown outside of it. She did not solve the mystery of RD, she did not explain the arrangement on Sundays. She did not identify who handled what through what channel. What she did, instead, was describe a world. She described a block in Harlem where over several decades of significant economic and social pressure, a community had maintained itself, not through official channels, not through the formal mechanisms of the state or the market, but through an intricate, largely invisible infrastructure of human relationships. She described a credit system that lived in one woman's memory, a dispute resolution process that convened at a church on Sundays, a property protection mechanism that operated through social obligation rather than legal contract, a communication network routed through a barbershop. And she described the limitations of her own ability to see it clearly, which, in retrospect, is perhaps the most important part of the work. I am an outside observer looking at a system designed, among other things, to be invisible to outside observers, she wrote in her conclusion. The invisibility was not incidental, it was structural. A community that has learned through experience that visibility brings scrutiny, and that scrutiny often brings harm, builds its most important functions in the shadows, not because those functions are shameful, but because exposure is dangerous. This is the central revelation of the investigation. The question that began all of this, ask about the arrangement on Sundays, was never answered because it couldn't be answered from the outside. Not because the people involved were hiding anything in the sense of concealing wrongdoing, but because the arrangement, whatever it was, belonged to a register of community life that was not intended for documentation. Some things are designed to be known only by the people who need to know them. This is true of every community. Every family, every neighborhood, every institution has things that are understood among members and opaque to outsiders. What made the arrangement on this block notable and what made it function was that the opacity was not accidental. It had been cultivated over time by people who understood that the things worth protecting needed to be protected in a particular way. The man standing near the barber shop, his hands in his coat pockets, watching the street without appearing to watch, he was part of this. Not a sentinel exactly, more like a thread in a fabric, one of many small, largely invisible acts of attention that, taken together, constituted the practice of community. The two women walking together, the weight of the bag pulling one of them slightly sideways, they were part of this. The web of walking companions, of who you walked with and where, was a kind of social annotation, a running text that the neighborhood read continuously. The child at the curb, absorbed in the concrete, that child was the future of this. Was the person who would carry the knowledge forward, not in any deliberate or formal way, but in the way that all of us carry the knowledge of the places that formed us, in habits of attention, in instincts about who to trust and why, in the particular way we understand what streets are for. And the shadow in the insurance office window, the always present figure, barely visible through the glass. We never learned who that was. We never learned what they were doing in there, day after day, in an office that appeared closed from the outside, and yet was never entirely empty. Maybe that is appropriate. Return now to the photograph. You have been looking at it for a long time, 30 minutes perhaps, or 40. You have been told about the housing inspector's note, and the researcher's 2 decades of work, and the oral history archive and its contradictions, and the property records, and the letters, and the person who may have been Robert Davenport, or may not have been anyone at all. And yet the photograph has not changed. It is still the same image it was when you first saw it, the same wet pavement, or pavement that appears wet, the same open curtains in the upstairs windows, the same storefronts, the same man with his hands in his coat pockets, the same 2 women, the same child at the curb. But you are not looking at it the same way you were looking at it before. Before it was a street, a historical photograph of a street in Harlem, black and white, slightly grainy, the kind of image that appears in textbooks to illustrate a period or a place. Now it is something else. Now it is a fragment of a system. It is one frozen moment in the continuous operation of something that had been built over decades by people who needed to build it, who had no other option, given what the formal world was offering them, but to build it themselves. You cannot see the system. You can only see its evidence, the way you cannot see gravity, but can see the way everything falls. The mystery, the arrangement on Sundays, the identity of RD, the nature of what was handled through the usual channel, remains unsolved. It will probably remain unsolved. The people who knew are gone or nearly so. The documents that existed were never complete, and some have been lost. The places themselves have changed, buildings renovated or demolished, storefronts turned over, the social geography of the block entirely transformed by the decades that followed this photograph. What we are left with is this image, and the questions it raises, and the partial answers that only make the questions more interesting. What did it take to hold a community together, when the formal systems designed to hold communities together were unavailable or hostile? It took Mrs. Purvis's memory of who owed what and who could be trusted. It took the barbershop's role as a clearinghouse for information that money couldn't buy. It took a church that was perhaps more than a church. It took someone, R or Robert or Raymond or some other name entirely, who knew enough people and had earned enough trust to be the switchboard for a network that was never mapped, because mapping it would have made it visible, and visibility was the one thing it could not afford. It took everyone, in small ways, the man watching the street without appearing to watch, the women who knew which way to walk and who to walk with, the child absorbing the rules of the place without knowing that rules were being absorbed. It took the block. And the block is what survives in this photograph, even though almost nothing else does. Look at it one more time before we end. The crack in the pavement near the curb, the long, branching line that suggests repair after repair, the accumulated evidence of a street that kept being put back together. That crack is still there, probably, under whatever surface covers it now. Still branching, still recording the history of every fracture and every mending. Cities are like this, communities are like this. The surface changes. Underneath, the evidence of what came before, of the breaks and the repairs, of what was built and held together, remains, if you know how to look for it. This photograph is one place to look. One frozen moment, one block, one set of questions that nobody ever finished answering. The investigation that ended with more questions than answers. Maybe that is how it should have ended.